Imagine a scenario where the Middle East's precarious peace shatters in an instant. At the heart of the crisis, a bold Iranian strike against Israel, a direct response to an April assault on Tehran's consular interests in Damascus. The retaliatory move isn't just about regional dynamics, it's about showing strength when pushed to the brink. As missiles arc over the sky, tracing paths of defiance and despair, the first hour of this conflict will set the tone for what would become one of the most consequential confrontations in modern history. Hour 1. Hundreds of missiles and drones will be sent from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen in a direct military attack on the Jewish state. But of the dozens of cruise missiles launched by Iran and its proxies, most will be intercepted by Israeli fighter jets or shot down by one of Israel's high-tech air defense systems, with only a handful of the 100-plus ballistic missiles that took flight actually falling inside Israel's borders. This initial barrage from Iran, lasting 4 or 5 hours, will cause minimal damage to mostly military targets. At the onset of this attack, the US military will also leap to Israel's defense, shooting down dozens of missiles and drones, primarily utilizing its nearby Navy destroyers like the USS Carney and USS Arleigh Burke, which were both stationed nearby in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The US Air Force's 494th Fighter Squadron, headquartered in Britain, and its 335th Fighter Squadron out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, will also get in on the action, sending 2 squadrons of F-15E Strike Eagles to take down dozens of Iranian attack drones. British Royal Air Force planes will, too, shoot down a number of drones headed for Israel. 5 hours into the war it effectively started, Iran might consider the matter closed, content to have made its point, even though it didn't necessarily inflict much damage. But will Israel take this action as Iran intended? Will they see it as a stern warning to them and their allies? A warning to Jerusalem and the Israel Defense Forces that if they step over the line again, they can expect a considerably more severe response. But what happens if Tehran's attempt at intimidation fails and Israel counters? If this happens, it won't matter that Iran intentionally chose long-range attacks that it knew Israel could easily counter. It won't matter that no US facilities were hit. If Israel does immediately strike back, ignoring the potential fallout of an equal or stronger response, and in spite of the many requests for clemency coming from top US military officials and the Pentagon, we will be that much closer to a full-scale war. The Israelis, however, already stretched thin from the war they've been fighting with Hamas, might not be looking to enter another full-on war with Iran. But as they have in the past, the Israeli leadership will be feeling intense pressure to retaliate. Too strong of a response, though, and these 2 countries, as well as their allies, will almost certainly find themselves at war. Hour 6. After consulting his war cabinet, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is still facing a great deal of domestic pressure after being charged with fraud and corruption back in 2019, might feel he has no choice but to take a hard line against Iran's clear escalation. He might take into consideration that the so-called Axis of Resistance, a network that extends Tehran's influence across the Arab world, which most notably includes Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, Iran has taken plenty of shots at them before. Before now, however, neither Iran nor Israel has overtly attacked the other at home. The hostilities have never risen to the level of face-to-face military confrontation. It seems that the war in Gaza may have tipped the scales. Hour 7. Some members of the Israeli government will be absolutely determined to launch a fierce and immediate counterstrike, even though President Joe Biden has made it perfectly clear that the United States military won't be a part of any offensive operations. So to strike a balance, to not upset its Western friends, while feeling compelled to respond, Israel will first strike at Iran's air defense systems, perhaps their most advanced systems, like the ones located at the Iranian airbase in Isfahan, in central Iran, that are responsible for protecting the Natanz nuclear facility. For this attack, instead of making a bolder statement and sending fighter jets into Iranian airspace, Israel will deploy a small squadron of quadcopters to confuse Iran's air defenses, then launch a pair of missiles from Syrian airspace several hundred kilometers to the west. Jumping ahead to hour 10, this is when we truly find ourselves at the flashpoint of this war. For if Israel doesn't immediately follow up this tempered strike with another, more forceful attack, it will effectively put the ball back in Iran's court. Maybe this was enough and Iran is already planning another strike, or perhaps Tehran is suspicious of Israel's modest retaliation, believing it to be just the beginning of a larger operation. If either of these is true, Iran will go back on the offensive, launching more of its own strikes, acting before any of its missiles or aircraft can be destroyed on the ground, before the sky above Natanz can fill with Israeli jets. Hour 12. Iran and its proxies launch another swarm of drones and hundreds more ballistic and cruise missiles, increasing the size of its previous attack, which was already one of the largest barrages of this kind in military history. Once the air assault ends, we might also see Iran directing its proxy forces, most likely Hezbollah militants, to attack Israel's ground borders from Syria or Lebanon. In terms of manpower, Iran does have a substantial advantage, with approximately 1.2 million active and reserve military personnel and thousands of artillery systems, while Israel only has around 750,000 combined troops, many of whom are actively engaged in operations in Gaza, as well as maintaining a defensive posture in the north to counter the ongoing threat from Hezbollah. Israel does, however, have a much more formidable armored division that includes over 2,200 tanks, nearly twice as many as Iran is believed to have. Either way, though, the nations are still separated by several countries – Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. From border to border, that's a distance of nearly 1,000 kilometers, which makes a land-based conflict between national armies highly improbable. Not to mention that any attempt by Iran to deploy troops to Iraq and Syria would almost certainly provoke an immediate and devastating response from US forces positioned in the region. But that doesn't completely take an organized ground attack by Hezbollah off the table. In addition to an array of small arms, machine guns, and hundreds of thousands of rockets at its disposal, Hezbollah boasts a range of anti-tank and anti-air systems, thousands of drones, and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles. The group has also already engaged in skirmishes with Israel along its northern border, as both sides have exchanged intermittent missile and drone strikes. Hour 17. Given a clear directive from Tehran, Hezbollah's leaders would likely move to step up their offensive operations in the north, isolating their attacks on the Galilee Panhandle, a finger of Israeli territory that juts into southern Lebanon, as they attempt to force IDF troops out once and for all. Mostly abandoned and overtaken by nature, the Finger of Galilee is a virtual no-man's land. Even families who have lived in the area for generations have had to flee. When it comes to this sort of ground-level urban combat, Israel's advanced air defense systems aren't much help. They are great at intercepting rockets that fly in high arcs and are difficult to aim, but in areas like Galilee, Hezbollah fighters often use rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles, which allow for more precise line-of-sight targeting and fly low to the ground. At the outset of a full-scale war, if Hezbollah was able to fully occupy the Galilee Panhandle, it would give their forces, as well as other Iranian proxies, a direct route from Lebanon into northern Israel. But given the lack of progress they've made so far, this is unlikely. A naval element to this war would also be unlikely. Despite Iran's recent aggressions in and around the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman, including the seizure of the MCS Ares, a Portuguese-registered merchant vessel Tehran claimed to be linked to Israel. In preparation for war with Israel, Iran would likely use Navy assets to escort its commercial vessels to safety in the Red Sea, where its Yemeni proxies, the Houthis, have been creating havoc since 2018. This means that the primary battles of the war will continue to be fought in the air, with both sides utilizing its arsenal of missiles, jets, and drones. Hour 25. Israel gets ready to deploy one or all of its long-range assets, F-35 stealth fighter bombers and precision deep strike intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. But even if Israel has better planes and a handful of nuclear-equipped submarines, Iran has the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Israel might have more capable ballistic missiles, but they've got fewer of them and less of a variety. Most of Iran's missiles were acquired from foreign allies, primarily North Korea, and Iran is still dependent on foreign suppliers for many key components and equipment, but it does have the technical and industrial capacity to develop long-range missiles, including ICBMs. In fact, the Islamic Republic is the only country to have developed a missile with a 2,000-kilometer range without having nuclear weapons first. Hour 26. Hezbollah fighters attempt to push over the border in the north, and Iran continues to send waves of missiles and drones toward key Israeli military targets. Non-nuclear ICBMs take flight in both directions, crossing paths in the sky high above Jordan and Iraq on their way to Tehran and Jerusalem. At this point, this long simmering conflict that was previously limited to secret assassinations, cyber attacks, nuclear sabotage, and isolated war-by-proxy land, sea, and air attacks will explode into a multinational conflict that directly and indirectly involves at least two nuclear power states. It's unlikely, but not impossible, that after the first round of ICBMs are exchanged, Israel will escalate to a nuclear response. Hypothetically, if they sent a cruise missile with a 150-kiloton nuclear warhead into the heart of Tehran, the blast would kill nearly 500,000 people, vaporizing everything within 1.35 square kilometers of the point of impact. Hour 30. If Israel does use a nuclear weapon against Iran, it will leave the world in a state of shock. Iran, that we know of, has no equivalent response, for Tehran has repeatedly denied having a nuclear weapons program, even if Supreme Leader Ayatollah al-Khamenei has also said that if they wanted to have one, their enemies wouldn't be able to stop them. If this is true, and Iran is unable to retaliate with nukes, either on its own or via one of its allies, the war between Iran and Israel effectively comes to an end. But the diplomatic consequences that Israel will face for this are nearly incomprehensible. Previously, the primary concern among the Israeli leadership has been that a nuclear-armed Iran would only be emboldened, increasing its support for its proxies, if not directly providing them with nuclear weapons to use against the Jewish state. After all, if Israel's nuclear arsenal hasn't been enough to deter Iran from launching a conventional strike, then what might happen once Iran is bringing nukes of its own to the proverbial bargaining table? Recently, an advisor to Iran's supreme leader said they'd have no choice but to build a nuclear bomb if Iran's existence were to be threatened. But let's rewind a bit. Long before the nuclear option hits the table, but as soon as Iran's first missiles take flight, what we're likely going to see is squadrons of Israeli fighters screaming towards Iran, targeting various air defense systems and missile launch facilities all across the country. The Israelis will be flying the very best US-manufactured combat aircraft that were specifically designed according to IAF requirements, meaning that the Israeli Air Force will certainly have the upper hand. Iran's Air Force employs approximately 37,000 personnel. However, years of international sanctions have significantly restricted its access to modern military technology. It has only a few dozen operational strike aircraft, Russian jets and aging US models acquired before the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The most capable of which is probably its Sukhoi 24s, a supersonic all-weather tactical bomber developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians have apparently tweaked some of theirs to carry tactical nuclear weapons, but the Su-24 was first developed in the late 1960s, a sign of the relative weakness of Iran's air force. One thing Iran does seem to have an abundance of, however, is drones. Tehran has provided more than 1,000 Shahed 136 UAVs, as well as Shahed 131 and Mohyah 6 UAVs to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so we can only assume they have thousands more to spare. Israel, on the other hand, has hundreds of F-15, F-16, and F-35 multi-purpose jet fighters, including stealthy variants like the F-35I Adir and less stealthy variants like the F-15I Ram. The Israeli Air Force does lack long-range bombers, though they might not need them in this war, though they do have a small fleet of repurposed Boeing 707s that serve as fueling tankers, which would allow its fighters to reach Iran and carry out multiple waves of precision sorties. Israel has also become a pioneer in drone technology. Among other assets, Israel Aerospace Industries has produced the IAI Heron pilotless plane that can travel 10.5 kilometers over 52 hours of continuous flight. But it's in terms of their air defense capabilities that Israel has an even larger advantage. Developed after the Gulf War with billions of dollars worth of help from the United States, Israel's multi-layer aerial defense system, along with its array of top-of-the-line fighter aircraft, gives them several additional options for shooting down long-range Iranian drones and missiles. The Arrow 3, which can intercept ballistic missiles above the Earth's atmosphere, is their highest altitude system, while an earlier model, Arrow 2, works at lower altitudes. Their mid-range system, known as David's Sling, is best suited to counter ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, while their so-called Iron Dome takes care of any short-range threats, like rockets and mortars, but can also, in theory, take down any of the more powerful missiles that the Arrow systems or David's Sling might miss. After determining that an incoming rocket is a threat, the Iron Dome will fire an interceptor, only if that threat will likely do damage to a populated area or important infrastructure. These systems are also linked to US bases in the region to facilitate an expedited response from coalition partners. This means that a large number of Iran's assets, particularly drones, will be shot down by Allied aircraft long before reaching Israel. It also means that we can expect to see, even during the earliest stages of the war, a notable upswelling of Allied defensive support. With all that said, if cooler heads prevail and Iran and Israel can both refrain from trading ICBMs and potentially nukes, this war will look much different. At around hour 25, instead of every major city in both Israel and Iran being turned to rubble and ash, we could see allies on both sides start to mobilize. After some diplomatic posturing, the US will likely step in, utilizing its full array of strategic offensive assets, cruise missiles, B-52 bombers, sub-launched ballistic missiles, as well as carrier and land-based jet fighters, to launch a sweeping attack against Iran's most valuable military assets. An attack that would likely be closely coordinated with Israel, if not performed jointly. Hour 30. Iran's only state ally in the Middle East is Syria, but the government of President Bashar al-Assad would probably not be too much help, given its ongoing struggle to re-establish control over the country following the outbreak of the civil war in 2011. Tehran has good relations with Moscow, but Putin's war in Ukraine would seriously limit Russia's ability to back them up, especially if the US is already directly involved. Iran is somewhat friendly with China too, which has brought Iranian oil in the past, but Beijing has current and future Western sanctions to worry about. This means that Iran's best hope for outside support is its axis of resistance. If the Iranian leadership were to instruct elements of some or all of these forces to begin a consolidated attack on Israel, the IDF, which is already committed to its war with Hamas, would be stretched very thin as it tried to defend Israel's borders. A coalition of Axis forces would do its best to push in and occupy Israeli territory, but it's hard to say how effective that would be. Hezbollah has been fighting with Israel for almost 20 years, while Iran-backed militias have continued to target US forces in Iraq and Syria, and Yemen's Houthis have continued to launch missiles and drones at Israel and carry out attacks in the Red Sea. But this regional coalition, whose members include the Syrian government, Hamas, and other militant groups from Iraq to Yemen, have only had marginal success, due partially to their differing priorities and unique domestic challenges. In fact, Hamas has already called on the Axis for help battling the IDF in Gaza. The Houthis have been on the losing end of several encounters with the US Navy, and as for Hezbollah, it took Lebanon years to rebuild after its war with Israel in 2006, and now, half a decade into a financial crisis that's driven up poverty and hollowed out the country's governing institutions, the leadership in Beirut aren't eager to enter another full-scale war with Israel and its allies. The US, now that it's found itself bankrolling Ukraine's defense against Russia and having fought two costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, doesn't want to see the conflict in Gaza spiral out into a war between nations either. But that doesn't mean it won't. If the US, as well as Israel's allies in Europe, truly want to deter regional war in the Middle East, they will need to convince Iran to rein in both its proxies and its nuclear program. Hour 48. As the Israel-dominated US-backed aerial war continues, we're going to see a serious escalation of the cyber war that's already been raging between these two countries. Instead of direct military engagement on the ground, Iran might aim to undermine Israel's military defenses and domestic stability. Since the conflict in Gaza began, cyber attacks against Israel have tripled. So in a war with Iran, Israel would need to brace itself for increased cyber hostility that will likely come in the forms of attacks on its information technology sector intended to disrupt, steal, or leak sensitive information. In the past, cyber attacks have allowed Iran to take regular shots at Israel while minimizing the risk of direct US action. Another way Iran might look to minimize the risk of pulling Israel's allies into the war or avoid a full-scale regional war altogether is by leaning on asymmetrical warfare tactics, like targeted assassinations or attacks on Israeli embassies and consulates in the West. Indirect actions that have allowed Iran's leaders to claim small, retaliatory victories without broadening the conflict beyond their control. If a war between Israel and Iran reaches this point, however, there will be no turning back. So why does Iran seem determined to escalate things now? Perhaps after the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, Tehran smelled blood in the water, leading them to a false impression that Israel could no longer defend itself alone. But given what's happened so far, that doesn't seem to be the case. And if this war really does happen, Iran might be facing a less patient, more ruthless Israel out to prove itself. In terms of who wins this war though, Iran or Israel, the reality is no one wins when a string of violent conflicts rooted in ideological differences is allowed to slowly escalate into a war between nations. But given Israel's success so far in defending itself against Iran's most credible threat, it's doubtful that Tehran possesses the military might needed to dominate this conflict in the air, on the ground, or at sea. So it's probably in Iran's best interest to consider the matter settled and go back to its previous war-by-proxy strategy. It would be wise, too, for the Iranian leadership to consider the level of strategic accuracy Israel has already displayed during its strike on their air defense systems in Isfahan. This should really tell Iran 2 things. 1, Israel would also like to avoid a full-scale war, and 2, it has the ability to hit whatever target it wants, whenever it wants. As the Israeli leadership decides what to do next, it would probably be wise of them to take a look at their own history. Back in 1991, during the Gulf War, Iraq fired 40 Scud missiles at Israeli civilian targets, killing 2 civilians and injuring several hundred people, in a deliberate attempt to draw Israel into the Gulf War. If then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir had taken the bait though, it would have fractured the 42-country coalition formed by US President George H.W. Bush that had aligned against Saddam Hussein after he ordered the invasion and occupation of Kuwait. To encourage Israel not to retaliate, the Bush administration sent over a shipment of Patriot missiles. Although not the most effective weapon for intercepting Iraq's Soviet-made Scud missiles, the Patriots did help persuade Shamir to stay out of the US-led war. And in the end, the anti-Iraq coalition held and quickly defeated Saddam. Clearly, Shamir understood the value of both international cooperation and restraint. Netanyahu, Israel's current president, was a deputy prime minister at the time and is considered by many to have been Shamir's mentee. Time will tell if he indeed follows in his mentor's footsteps. Since the earliest years of Israel's existence, largely due to numerous wars intended to erase it from the map, the country has maintained a self-defense strategy rooted in the notion that the best defense is a good offense. Formerly known as the Begin Doctrine, this policy was named after Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who famously authorized the bombing of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981. As work on the plant neared completion, a plant Israel believed would have the capacity to produce plutonium for warheads, Prime Minister Begin dispatched 8 F-16s to preemptively destroy it. It seems, however, that Netanyahu's government is taking a softer approach when it comes to Iran, who in defiance of Western pressure has pushed on with its nuclear program, claiming but not proving that it does not intend to weaponize the program. Since Iran launched its attack in April, there has been intense speculation as to whether Israel will lean back on its previous nuclear defense strategy or simply hope Tehran won't dare to cross that line. With its attack on Iran's air defense systems that were guarding at least one uranium enrichment site at Natanz, Israel has shown that it could also have hit several major nuclear facilities if it wanted to. But maybe not. Israel has known for years that an attack on Iran's numerous and well-fortified nuclear facilities would be much more difficult than its 1981 campaign in Iraq. Iran is larger and farther away, and taking out its facilities would require a sustained bombing campaign by the Israeli Air Force, which is more accustomed to limited precision strikes. For now at least, it looks as though both sides have taken a step back from the brink of war, but the Middle East is a far more dangerous and precarious place because of these recent events. Both Israel and Iran have crossed a critical red line, both militarily and symbolically. And it's certainly possible that either country could be the one to push this conflict past the point of no return. But what do you think? Have Iran and Israel already reached that point? Are these two countries, as well as their allies, headed for a full-scale war? And if they are, who would win? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now go and check out if the US and Iran go to war, who wins, hour by hour? Or click this other video instead.